Have you ever wondered why you have different amounts of cache, memory, and storage in a system and why they're layered in such a way? Well, the whole point about that is about accesses to memory and to data. Intel had one of the most novel technologies in the market for decades in their 3D crosspoint technology that they productized and called Optane. However, as of last week, Intel is now officially shuttering that division. So unfortunately, we no longer have Optane for you. However, we do have today's sponsor.
If you want an independent cloud services provider for home servers, VPNs, or clients, consider Linode and sign up today at linode.com/TechTechPotato for a free $100 60-day credit. A recent Gartner performance report shows Linode's topology offers almost double the database performance per dollar than other public cloud services.
What's your minimum specification? So let's roll everything back and start from basics. CPU has L1 cache, L2 cache, maybe L3 cache, then some DRAM, then some storage. That's 5 levels of hierarchy. And the idea is that the further you go away from the CPU, the longer it takes to access. So it takes longer to access your storage than it does your memory, and it's longer to access your memory than it does your cache. However, there are also size differences between them. So the closer you get to your CPU core, the smaller your cache is. So your L1 cache may only be 32 kilobytes or 64 kilobytes. Then you maybe go up to a megabyte. Then you maybe go up to 16 megabytes. Then you go gigabytes of DRAM, and then terabytes of NVMe or SSD storage, and then maybe even more terabytes of hard disk drive storage and spinning Rust. The whole point is with a hierarchical system, if you need data quickly and you need it repeatedly, it should be closer to where your CPU needs it. This helps you hide bottlenecks in terms of latency, and if you've got good branch predictors, good memory controllers, running fast memory, you can keep that data close to the core to keep it active for longer. Now, Intel developed a new technology that essentially fit in 2 areas of that, what they call the pyramid of Optane. The technology is called 3D crosspoint, and it's kind of as the name suggests. What you have is a memory-like structure based on Chalco glass resistive memory, though I do remember a briefing with Chris Mellor from Blocks and Files where he was shouting at Intel saying, why won't you tell us that this is a phase change Chalco glass memory, and they kept denying that it was. However, in 2015, at IDF, we saw the big announcement of this new technology. Intel had been developing it in collaboration with Micron for the last 4, 5, 6 years, and this was their big reveal. The whole point was that they can have something which is more durable than DRAM, can actually keep its data like storage. However, there was a slight latency penalty. So you ended up with something between DRAM and SSD that was faster than SSD to access, slower than DRAM, but you could get terabytes of this stuff. Whereas with main memory DRAM, you may have 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, or in a server, 512 gigabytes. With Optane, the idea was you can have terabytes and terabytes before going to, a proper, say, flash storage system with 30 terabytes, the next step down. This was the whole pyramid of Optane messaging that Intel and Micron gave at IDF in 2015. And as Intel wants to do with some of these technologies, like embedded multi-die interconnect bridge, EMIB, they've been working on it for years before they announce it and before they show development in future upcoming platforms. Now, after that announcement, we had expected Optane to come to the market in around 2 to 3 years after that, and unfortunately with delays to 10 nanometer, the first gen, and renaming some of those processes, we eventually saw it come out with Skylake. The Skylake Xeons had official Optane 100 series support. So the whole point about this memory is that between Micron and Intel, it would be co-manufactured at a fab in Letty, Utah, where Intel and Micron had an effective 50-50 stake in the business, in production, and in the dies that came off production. Micron did kind of productize their half of all the memory in terms of a Quantex brand and offering. However, as we understand it, they actually sold most of their supply to Intel for Intel Optane. There were a few delays, and on top of that, there were also questions about the performance. And this comes down to some of Intel's marketing issues with this product. So there were, or initially when it was advertised as something that goes in between DRAM and storage. What it ended up being is something that goes in between DRAM and storage, but there was another product that was essentially the storage version. And we ended up with another product beyond that, which was cache for hard drives or cache for slower NAND. So ultimately, 3 different products came out of Intel in the end. If we start at the bottom and work our way up, Intel initially sold 16 and 32 gigabyte Optane drives, something like this. This is the Optane memory series, 32 gigabytes. This is even an early engineering sample. And the idea was you put this in your system ahead of a hard drive, and it acted as a caching layer. So you had a system, typically a mobile system, that had a quad-core CPU, had maybe 8 gigabytes of memory, 32 gigabytes of Optane, like an NVMe drive, but it was a caching NVMe drive, and then maybe a terabyte of hard drive spinning Rust. After that, Intel has what they call the Optane memory, which isn't memory, it's storage, where they would use 16 or 32 gigabytes and put it in front of some flash NAND. So you essentially had an SSD with a fast Optane caching system. Those were the H10 and the M10 and the H10, I believe. Then Intel sold SSDs that were purely Optane, so kind of like this caching drive, but instead of having 16 or 32 gigabytes, they either had 56 gigabytes or 118 gigabytes. Yeah, the math doesn't work either, but go with me on this. And on the enterprise side, they had multiple systems, the P4800X, the P5800X, where you'd have 375 gigabytes, 400 gigabytes, or 800 gigabytes, or 1.6 terabytes purely of Optane. The idea that this was fast storage that acted like storage, even though it had it had the repeat cycles of DRAM, and the fact that it could hold its data, unlike DRAM, wasn't really a benefit because it was just essentially replacing SSDs. And those Optane enterprise SSDs look kind of like this. I've got 2 on a U.2 form factor card here, though you could get them in half height, half length cards as well. And then beyond that, you had Optane DC persistent memory, Optane DCPMM. These are the memory modules. This is really what Optane was meant to be and what it was advertised for initially. And in those early days, Intel made some big claims. So Charlie from Semi-Accurate actually had a good write-up at the time of this. They were advertising that Optane would be 1,000x faster than NAND, 1,000x endurance than NAND, 10x denser than a conventional DRAM memory. So you could essentially have something, again, somewhere between normal DRAM and SSDs, but that was persistent memory, and you could essentially have a system with what looked like 6 terabytes of DRAM, though it was also persistent DRAM, that you could address on a bit level. However, and then with that messaging, Intel said, up to 4x the memory capacity and at half the cost of DDR. So if you consider, say, DDR at $10 per gigabyte, the whole point was with Optane was that it would be around $5 per gigabyte, but instead of equipping your system with 128 gigabytes, you could equip your system with 2 terabytes, 3 terabytes. However, as I said, initially, Intel launched with those initial SSD products, and the SSD products acted like SSDs, not like DRAM, and so the messaging was a bit muddled. Instead of saying 1,000x performance, Intel was saying only 10x performance on latency, 3x performance on endurance over NAND, 4x improvement over write IOPS. These were nowhere near the 100x or the 1,000x that Intel were initially promising. And so people got a little disheartened, basically saying, did you lie to us when you first announced this hardware? I, at the time, this was kind of like, say, the 2016, 2017 timeframe, I was still really hopeful. The thing was, some projects required lots and lots of DRAM, and having access to terabytes of DRAM rather than having to go out into main memory, that was very appealing. And I remember some of those initial benchmarks we got to do on that system. We kind of almost didn't know how to use it. And with the Optane DC persistent memory, you could actually run it in 2 different modes. And the 2 different modes, if you know anything about the Xeon Phi, you might remember these. So there was memory mode. Memory mode is the one that's easiest to understand. What you have is the Optane DC persistent memory essentially acts as your massive bank of DRAM. So if you have 2 terabytes of Optane DC persistent memory, you essentially have 2 terabytes of DRAM in your system. You could have conventional DDR4 memory in that system, say 128 gig stick, and that would act as a caching layer for your main DRAM. For your Optane. So you ended up having this sort of caching layer for your Optane DC persistent memory. So that's the one that's actually easiest to understand because that integrates into a regular workflow. The benefit of Optane DC persistent memory that wasn't part of a normal workflow was called App Direct mode. So because you have Optane DC persistent memory, it just looks like a standard DRAM module. It goes straight into a standard DDR4 DRAM slot. You would have your normal DRAM, but then all your Optane memory would be mounted as if it were a disk drive in your system. So you'd have a disk drive with, say, 2 terabytes of DRAM-like speed, slightly slower latency, but much, much faster than anything storage can provide. And Intel sold this on the fact that systems that run on databases require lots and lots and lots of fast, local, and as local as you can get it to the CPU storage. But beyond that, if you have a system that is shut down and needs to restart and re-prepare everything back into memory, if it starts off in a fast storage environment, then that was the benefit Optane gave to you. Now, in terms of the Optane DC persistent memory module itself, it looked like a standard DRAM module. I mean, you'll probably see this picture I've posted so many times online, but it's a standard DDR module, a DDR4 for the 100 and 200 series, and you have what looks like Optane on board, but it has essentially an FPGA or ASIC controller that helps manage where the data goes, helps with reliability, and if there are any failures, helps with failover failures, and then ECC and all that stuff. So that was the way that Optane DC persistent memory was meant to be presented to customers. You had the 100 series, that was DDR4 2666. That was for Skylake and Cascade Lake. You then had the 200 series, which was DDR4 3200, designed for Cooper Lake and Ice Lake. And theoretically, there was meant to be a 300 series called Crow Pass, which was essentially the 200 series, but instead of having a DDR4 controller on board, you had a DDR5 controller on board. But it was essentially meant to be roughly the same thing. So Intel, through this time, even though there were delays, they were pretty consistent in the messaging, saying we have a first generation, second generation, third generation. It's iterating on. We're working in the Latency fab. We're working with Micron, and we're bringing this technology to market. Intel, while they gave us access to a remote server with the memory, never actually sampled the memory directly until Ice Lake, which I thought was a little bit weird. I repeatedly asked Intel, can we get some Optane DC persistent memory in for testing? But it never came across our desk until Ice Lake. And even then, they gave us the smallest modules of it. So initially, it was also very expensive. They were saying half the cost of DDR. And because DRAM is a commodity, it's already a race to the bottom, essentially. So if you want half the cost of that per gigabyte, you need a compelling product. And at the time, a lot of investors, a lot of analysts were saying, look, people aren't going to buy this because it costs too much. Intel were very adamant, saying, no, this is a value add for the customers that need it, and they will pay for the benefits of having it. Well, so that didn't happen. And in 2020, this fab in Letty, Utah, that was the 50% Micron, 50% Intel, due to agreements, Intel had to sell its 50% to Micron. So at that point, from was it early 2021, Intel no longer had a manufacturing facility making Optane for its own uses. As I said, Micron still had 50% of the Optane from before that, but as we understand it, they were just simply selling it back to Intel at the time. So Intel sells the fab in 2020 to Micron, and then Micron makes an announcement saying that they are pulling out of the 3D XPoint Optane business in early 2021. Then they sell the Leti fab in mid-21 to Texas Instruments for $900 million. So yeah, at that point, nowhere in the world was manufacturing Optane, the Optane 3D XPoint. Intel had said that they still had plans for Optane, even through all of that, even through to 2 weeks ago, they were still saying, we have a future for Optane. The idea was that Intel would be doing the research and development in their 3D NAND facility in Dalian, China. Well, that was sold to SK Hynix last year, and a new company has formed out of that sale called Solidigm or Solidigm, because it's actually a really bad name for a company. So at this point, Intel is basically saying, yeah, we're fully committed to Optane, but we have nowhere that's doing the research and nowhere that's actually doing the manufacturing. And this is a sort of product where you need, I guess, at least 900 million, if not a couple of billion, in order to start manufacturing again. And the reason why nobody else had done this in the past is that the technology was new. Intel had obviously put in the right patents to make sure that nobody else could copy it. And it just ended up being quite expensive to manufacture. We never had any sort of insight into yields or what have you. So even with these roadmaps, Intel saying, we've had 100 series, we have a 200 series, we've got the SSDs, we've got the consumer products. So the consumer products kind of faded away pretty quickly. And then as of Intel's financial announcements within the last week, in a small byline in that document, it says that Intel is shutting down its Optane memory small m business. We clarified with Intel. This means all product lines, whether you're talking about the caching SSDs, whether you're talking about the enterprise SSDs, or the DC persistent memory, that's it. There are going to be no more products. In that financial announcement, Intel obviously had to write down all the Optane inventory they still have, which is around $600 million. And this is a quarter where Intel's actually lost money for the first time in quite a while. So with the write down, even though it's not in the gap, there should be a warehouse full of Optane memory. So Intel, if you're watching, I would much love to get some hands on multiple terabytes of this stuff. If you're just going to end up binning it, please send some my way. But I pushed Intel because this announcement, it kind of came out of the blue. Some people said that they saw the writing on the wall months in advance, perhaps even years in advance. There wasn't wide adoption of this technology. There wasn't wide adoption of the product. It was quite expensive. So I reached out to Intel. I said, can you confirm that's all the memory? And they said yes. And I said, well, can you confirm what's happening with the current generation product? Is that still going to be supported to the end of life that was guaranteed when it was sold, the product discontinuance? Are you going to be working with partners? What does it mean for future platform support? And they turned around and they gave me a secondary statement, which I'll read for you now. So Intel stated that it will continue development of its third generation Optane 300 series called CrowPass on Sapphire Rapids while we engage with key customers to determine their interest in adoption of this product. It was expressed pretty clearly, but it's good to reiterate that we're committed to supporting Optane customers and ecosystem partners through the transition of our existing memory and storage product lines through to end of life. So that means that there may be an Optane product on Sapphire Rapids, though Sapphire Rapids has experienced additional delays, and we'll perhaps go through that in another video. But if you're a customer and you're on Optane and you've found that it's a really good niche for your product that adds value, you need to reach out to Intel today and tell them you want to work with them more closely on adoption of CrowPass for Sapphire Rapids. Because ultimately what they're going to be doing is taking that memory that they do have in their inventory, they're going to be sticking a DDR5 controller on it, and then essentially selling it as is. You may not even get a warranty on it. So Intel sounds like it could still be committed to delivering for you if you really need it. Now, when this announcement came out, again, there were customers who are using this product today, either in app direct mode or just simply in memory mode, that find value in this product. I'm kind of sad because I kind of wished I was able to get my hands on more of it. All I've got here is, kind of 2 enterprise SSDs. And, these are really good if you want to do something stupid like chia mining. So I would love some more of these. It's just a shame that sometimes for these technologies to take hold, you need decades of graft essentially to get them to market. And if they're not price performance competitive at that moment in time, well, that could shutter a whole business. And Intel's been doing quite a lot of that lately. My minimum specification here is we need to look to the future. And the future is very much pinned on CXL, Compute Express Link, where you can do these kind of Optane memory type environments in a disaggregated structure, and you can use persistent memory for that. Optane would have been ideal for that. The idea that you can have a fabric across a network, across a supercomputer, across an enterprise installation, where you essentially have just a box full of DRAM, or a box full of this Optane, a box full of persistent memory, and you could partition it to any system in a network you wanted, as long as you could deal with the extra latency, of course. That would have been an ideal situation for Optane. That's possible through CXL. However, we're going to have to wait another couple of years, really, for CXL to take hold in the industry, and another few more years on top of that before it becomes widespread adoption. So Optane was perhaps a product that was too early, innovative for the time, but too early for the workflows that really need it. Many thanks to everybody who's watching, and if you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe. There is a Patreon, patreon.com/TechTechPotato, if you want to join our Discord. I'm also now writing a newsletter called morethanmore.substack.com. That's going to be more of sort of my financial outlook. Some of you may see some scripts to some videos and interviews there as well. So you can go up there, subscribe for the free newsletter, or if you really, really like it, there is a paid subscription for some of the more paywally type stuff. But I hope to see you sometime soon.